Hello and welcome along. So today we're going to finally finish off the series I started on the early years of each legion. So that was the time before they had met their Primarchs. And the last one to do in this series is the Salamanders. I put these off for quite a while, mainly because I did a big video on them about a particular battle that was very early in their history, and it kind of felt like doing this video would be too soon after that. But I think finally it's time to do it. So here we go. So the first thing to say about the Salamanders is they were one of the three legions that when the Emperor created them, he kept them somewhat separate from the other legions and somewhat more secret. So these were the Space Wolves, the Alpha Legion, and the Salamanders. These three legions together were, for some reason, were kept more secret, more separate than the others. And this is said to have led them to be more distant from the other legions, and so they didn't form as closer bonds with the other legions in the early days, and that may have contributed to them in later times being viewed with somewhat more suspicion and distrust than the other legions had for each other. Now, famously with the Space Wolves and the Alpha Legion, the character of their legion led to those early days of mistrust because of not knowing much about them, leading to even more distrust and distance between the legions because of their activities. Now, of course, the Alpha Legion are famous for their secrecy and their many complex interwoven plans that mean that even their allies rarely know what they're really up to, while the Space Wolves became known for being both excessively violent and hard to control, to the point where they would often turn on each other and frequently went too far in killing non-combatants and potentially actually made things worse for the Imperium rather than better. They were something of a blunt instrument in their early days before they were reunited with Russ. But even after being reunited with Russ, they continued with a reputation of being different from the other legions, not being as able to develop the camaraderie between legions that some of the others were able to do. Partly this was cultivated by the Legion and Russ because they wanted this image of themselves as something other, something outside of the normal Legion organization, and someone that was keeping a watch on everybody else for anyone doing anything wrong, which they would then punish them for. Now, we don't really know if that's what the Emperor had created them for, or if he endorsed this, but it was certainly something that they felt they were supposed to do, and they deliberately kept this distance between them and the other legions because of this. Now, with the Salamanders, it was slightly different, but they still had this problem. When they were first revealed to the general public and to the other legions, it was at a very specific time and for a very specific purpose. Now, they were used in a battle, a very large battle at the end of the Unification Wars, known as the Assault on the Tempest Galleries. Now, I've done a whole separate video about this, so I'm not going to go into it here, but essentially, before this, no one really knew anything about them. And when they were revealed, they were already quite large, so 20,000 strong, and seemingly purposely created to perform the task required to win this battle. So after this video, go and watch that video if you want to know more about this. I'll link it up here or here somewhere. And their involvement in this battle, their successful involvement in this battle, did win them some friends and admirers. It didn't totally put to bed this distance, this suspicion that they had around them, just with the other two legions. And so they continued with this somewhat until eventually Vulcan taking over the Legion and his character, the changes he made to the Legion, etc., would lead them to becoming more brought into the fold, more trusted and liked by the other legions. But before they had Vulcan to help them, the Legion's specific character did somewhat keep them alienated from the other legions and lead to continued suspicion about them and even a dislike of serving with them. So we'll go a bit more into the details of why that came about. So after the Battle of the Tempest Galleries, it was clear that the Legion couldn't be sent straight out into the rest of the Great Crusade, as that would start to happen, because their numbers had been reduced so dramatically. The 20,000 that had existed before the battle were reduced to about 1,000. They needed time to build up their numbers, build up equipment, etc., to be ready to be put into the Great Crusade. They ended up getting tasks that were more about reacting to problems that might occur in the territory that had already been conquered and supporting the other legions. So the other legions were spearheading these expeditionary fleets going out into the galaxy, conquering whole planets, etc. while the Salamanders were reacting to uprisings or unusual events such as a space hulk appearing in Imperial space that needed to be investigated, or a random raids from aliens that had penetrated deeper into Imperial territory, where the other legions, being mostly on the front lines, were too far away to respond to, but a relatively small force of Salamanders could be sent to go and deal with it. And this led to them often fighting divided into these smaller groups rather than as a legion. Even though the legion was small, these type of engagements required even smaller forces, more spread out within Imperial territory, so that they could react to these situations when they arose more quickly. Now, because of this, they didn't therefore interact with the other legions much, which sort of increased that space between them and the other legions, which had developed from that secrecy around their creation. Although they had gained quite a lot of respect from their victory at the Battle of the Tempest Galleries, it didn't carry over that long, because they just seemed to disappear into the background doing these little minor tasks, or as it might appear to be. If you're on the front line, you're a legion, leading the way out into the galaxy, conquering whole worlds, whole planetary systems, etc. The kind of things that the Salamanders are doing are kind of, may seem relatively insignificant. So they out of the consciousness of the main military leaders and thinkers, including the other legions. Now, being used like this led to a few things developing within the legion. So the first thing is they became quite skilled at dealing with random situations, because everything they were doing was different. Every time they get sent out on a job, it'd be slightly different, and they would accrue these skills. So they were quite capable of dealing with a lot of different situations. But it also meant they were often relatively small numbers of Astartes with other troops, so normally human troops, which they kind of led and became almost like an officer corps for. So they got used to working in close collaboration with humans and taking care of them in a way, to be commanding them and being responsible for them. Now, other legions did also have a little bit of this going on in their early career. Ultramarines did this to a certain extent, but they took on more of a kind of a policeman type of role. And the Emperor's Children also had something of this, who were also famously very small in their early days. But the Emperor's Children, having a tradition of being drawn from nobility, kind of saw themselves as superior to the people that they were commanding, that kept a bit more of a distance between them than what the Salamanders had with the people that they were commanding, who although were obviously superior in the fact that they were Astartes, didn't have that kind of cultural superiority that the Emperor's Children had within them. And so they were somewhat closer to the human forces that they commanded. This, you might think, might lead them to being loved and admired amongst the wider Imperial forces and humanity as a whole. But what tended to happen is that in these engagements, they were usually quite desperate. So they were sent because there was no one else to send. They were very difficult odds to face. And this meant that the casualty rates were very high. And so it became to the point where if you were deployed with the Salamanders, you kind of knew you had a good chance of dying. And so people somewhat resented that and did not look forward to being deployed to the Salamanders, simply because it was probably a death sentence. And the Salamanders themselves had this character quirk, you could say, where they kind of looked forward to the idea of self-sacrifice. They looked forward to the opportunity to die for the Imperium. And it became one of their defining characteristics that they were, yes, incredibly capable and loyal, but they were also prone to putting themselves into situations that couldn't be won, or could be won, but only at massive loss. And, that's not actually a great reputation to have amongst your allies, because it starts to look like you're almost wanting to fail for the chance to sacrifice yourself. It's a martyr complex. You want people to love you for your sacrifice, so you do things that you shouldn't really be doing just so you can be sacrificed. Now, of course, this isn't entirely a fair picture of the Salamanders. It's more the story that started to develop around them, slightly out of their control, because of just how many times they would get themselves in these situations where they would take such heavy casualties, and those with them would also take these heavy casualties. And so, yes, partly it probably was, to a certain extent, their fault in being too eager to sacrifice themselves for the Imperium. But at the same time, they were doing something that the Imperium needed to be done these were desperate situations that someone had to address. And if they hadn't done them, if they had just said, no, that's too difficult a task, well, the Imperium would have suffered for that anyway. And so perhaps it's unfair to judge them as being too eager to sacrifice themselves. It's hard to say, because obviously these are all kind of stories that build up around their activities in these early days. It does seem like that when they were attached to other legions, those legions didn't look favourably on them in terms of tactics, in that they felt that they were too inclined to do things that would lead to massive casualties. They were involved in a particularly large battle for them, in which they fought alongside the Ultramarines, and the Ultramarines Lord Commander Actia is reported to have said that they were basically their own worst enemy. They sowed the seeds of their own destruction. And now, obviously, the Ultramarines are sticklers for very specific tactics. Even in these early days, they were, before they had the Codex Astartes to work from. They still had their very set ideas about the way you should do things, and they often found fault in other legions not fighting exactly how they would prefer them to. But in this case, their criticism was that the Salamanders were just too willing to sacrifice themselves, almost to a point of being suicidal in the way that they fought. So I think it probably is a genuine criticism in there. Now, of course, because they fought like this, and because they kept getting put on these missions that were essentially missions of desperation, that meant that they were often facing overwhelming odds, and it meant that their casualty rate was incredibly high all the time. So they just could not build up their numbers. So they kind of stayed with these low numbers, kind of stuck in a vicious cycle where they couldn't build up the numbers high enough to be used in full legion strength and go out and do the normal things that larger legions did. So they kept doing these jobs, but the high casualty rates of these missions kept their numbers low and kept them divided. So they were stuck doing this. And really, they wouldn't break from this cycle until Vulcan would come along. And like some of the other legions, it reached a point where people in the Imperium's hierarchy started to doubt whether they would really continue as a legion, and they may just fade away and disappear simply because they could not break out of this cycle and build up their numbers to be an actual legion. Now, fortunately for the Salamanders, eventually Vulcan would be found, and he would make some changes that would help them come together as a legion and start to grow their numbers again. Now, in typical Salamander style, this would begin at the Battle of Antame. This was a battle that the Salamanders were fighting against orcs, and this was a battle that was incredibly desperate and was resulting in huge casualties, and the Salamanders were slowly getting destroyed, like many of the battles they fought in. But unfortunately, the scale of this battle was larger, and so it could eventually have led to their complete destruction. Now, the battle itself is quite an interesting one and probably deserves a separate video, because there's actually quite a lot that goes on. But the key element for the Salamanders is that Vulcan appears with a fresh batch of recruits from Nocturne, which is the planet he had landed on and would become the Salamander's home world. He brought with him something like 3,000 recruits, and he brought himself, more importantly. So he basically rescued them from this battle. He strode into the battle, smashing orcs left, right, and centre. The ferocious and effective actions of these new recruits alongside Vulcan led to victory over the orcs, and it also led to the existing Salamanders, seeing them in battle, to immediately accept them as their own. They essentially united at this point under Vulcan. And quite conveniently, the current Lord Commander of the Salamanders received a mortal wound in the battle, but survived just long enough to formally pass power over to Vulcan. And everyone knelt to Vulcan, and Vulcan told them to get up, because he doesn't believe in that kind of thing. No, Vulcan isn't as he said, he's not a petty king. He doesn't want them to worship him or to bow down to him. He sees himself as an equal with them, and that's how he wants them to behave. He goes on to teach them his Promethean Creed, which is this kind of ancient tradition from Nocturne, and he molds the Legion into his own form, a Legion that takes the best of the old Salamanders, their willingness to self-sacrifice, their high level of technical skill and affinity with technology, but combines it with a more reasonable philosophy, which taught them to control their anger, to control their rage, and to funnel it into a more effective tactics, and to not win at all costs. but instead to win. So they would start to accept that sometimes you do need to retreat, just for tactical reasons, so that you don't get wiped out or that your allies don't all die while you insist on staying in this one spot. So he did improve them, but he didn't try and break them down like some of the other Primarchs did with their own legions and then rebuild them completely in his own image. He just wanted to slightly guide them to a better place, and that's what he did, and they embraced it. And the Salamanders, after that point, with him as their leader, began to build up their numbers more as they suffered less casualties. They had a homeworld to recruit from. They had a better supply, more reliable supply of recruits coming in. And he, as a person, was very much liked and respected throughout the Imperium and by the other Primarchs. And so his reputation helped to heal their reputation, to bring them more into the fold. So they gained a great deal in being united with Vulcan and him taking on the mantle as the Legion Master. Now, something that's interesting to note with Vulcan taking over the Legion is that was delayed by quite a long time by the Emperor. So the Emperor found Vulcan, but didn't immediately bring him to the Legion and say, here you go, here's your Legion. He kept him with him, by his side, trained him, mentored him, developed his skills, watched him in battle many times. So he had almost kind of like what he did with Horus in the early days, had him around very close to him and personally mentoring him to become the best version of himself, presumably. Now, why he did this specifically with Vulcan and not with some of the other Primarchs is hard to say. We don't really know what the Emperor's motives are all the time. I mean, they're often very mysterious, but it may play into this idea that Vulcan has a very special purpose and that the Salamanders themselves have a very special purpose in the Emperor's plans. And originally, it might seem that they were created specifically for the assault on the Tempest galleries, that beyond that, there is a greater plan for both the Salamanders and Vulcan. And that's more Vulcan's story rather than the Salamanders, so we won't get into that here. But that time away from the Legion meant that they did suffer quite a bit more than they needed to, because Vulcan had been reunited with the Emperor earlier than it would seem, and rather than keeping him by his side, he could have taken him to the Legion and perhaps kept the Legion and Vulcan by his side while he mentored him, and then Vulcan could have mentored them, and perhaps that would have saved quite a lot of lives of the early Salamanders who were still being sent on these suicidal missions and still had this deep need for self-sacrifice within them that was not being controlled or focused in the way that it would be under Vulcan. So this potentially is one of those examples where the Emperor does things in a way that you think, well, you didn't really need to do it like that, did you? Could have saved quite a lot more people if you'd have just done it slightly differently. But the Emperor does work in mysterious ways. Okay, so that is the Salamanders and their early years before they were united with Vulcan, their Primarch. So let me know what you think of the Salamanders in the comments. I'm never really sure how popular the Salamanders are. I personally like them a lot. I think they're quite an interesting legion. They've got an interesting background, an interesting culture of their own. And they look cool because they look like dragons. Tell me what you think of the Salamanders. Do you have a soft spot for them, or maybe they're your favourite legion? It would be interesting to know if you don't like them. That would be interesting as well. If you don't like the Salamanders, what is it about them that you don't like? And if you don't like Vulcan, tell me, because everybody likes Vulcan, right? Anyway, so please like, subscribe, and share. Otherwise, I will see you next time.